So we are now live on Facebook and glad that all of you are able to join us today. And I am Mark Kligman, and I am the director of the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience at UCLA. And as a partner with Geraldine Arbach from London, we welcome you to today's session. This is our 38th session for Conversations on Zoom. And I want to thank Geraldine for all of her hard work to make sure that all these sessions work out every week, preparing the speakers, making sure that everyone is notified. So a big thanks to Geraldine. And also on our end at UCLA to Lori Black, who really helps us with making sure everything's posted and online. And in addition to that, to some of our students, Eva and Joanna, who are always helpful in the background. So today's session, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest, Bruce Adolphe, a well-known composer and I guess radio personality in the world of classical music and making classical music accessible. And we're going to look at a new work of his, but I won't spoil the surprise of any part of the content. And our host or moderator will be Dr. Jeff Janeczko, who's the Chief Operating Officer of the Milken Archive of American Jewish Music. Jeff and I work very closely together on many activities, and always impressed with Jeff's just incredible knowledge and dedication. And it's with great pleasure that I'll introduce Jeff to then begin our session. So Dr. Jeff Janeczko, good morning.
Thank you, Mark. This is the third time I've been privileged to present to this group through a series we're calling Composer in Focus, looking at different composers who have contributed to the Milken Archive. I got to present with Mark. Mark and I together got to present Sam Adler during the very early days of this session about a year ago. And then in December, I got to present David Amram. And I'm very happy today to be able to present the work of Bruce Adolphe. However, our session today will be a little bit different, and that will be focusing on some fairly recent composition of his, rather than trying to cover his body of work over a very long span of time. Bruce is a very versatile composer who writes chamber music, orchestral music, and opera, which he has put into three general categories of works inspired by science, the visual arts, and human rights. In the first category, he's worked with the renowned neurologists Antonio and Hannah Damasio, who run the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC. And Yo-Yo Ma premiered his piece for cello and two percussionists called Self Comes to Mind, which is based on the Damasio's work in neuroscience and creativity. And I'm sure he'll be happy to talk more about that during the Q&A. In the second category, he has composed music about the painter Paul Gauguin and several pieces inspired by abstract expressionist painters. And today we're going to be focusing on that last category, which is his music that deals with human rights. I do want to mention, I think I'm taking a lot of that description of his music from Bruce's own description of his music, but I think Bruce also composes a number of works that engage with ideas, that engage with philosophy and the literary arts, as well as all of these other areas we have talked about. Bruce is also known for his radio show and podcast, Piano Puzzlers, and I was just wondering how many of you on this call might be familiar with the Piano Puzzlers. All I will say now is that Piano Puzzlers is a music game show that Bruce has been doing on the radio for many years. And whether or not you are familiar with the Piano Puzzlers, you're in for a treat, because Bruce is going to treat us to a piano puzzler today, and you'll have a chance to play along with this very fun music game. I first met Bruce probably about 10 years ago through my work with the Milken Archive. Initially, we just kind of traded emails and came to know one another virtually, we should say, as most of us are getting to know people these days. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, Bruce was in Los Angeles for the premiere of one of the pieces we will be listening to today. I should say it was not the premiere. He was there for a performance of one of the pieces that we'll be learning about today. So I invited him to come to the offices of the Milken Family Foundation in Santa Monica and got to do an oral history for him to add Bruce's very fascinating story to the Milken Archives oral history project. He's a composer whose music I appreciate greatly, but I also, I've come to appreciate how good Bruce is at talking about music and explaining music, which is a big part of what he does as part of his career. And of course, when we met to record this oral history for the Milken Archive, I learned that he knows about all kinds of other things, and he's really good at talking about those as well. So he's a very, a wonderful composer, a wonderful person, and a very smart human being. So I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk with him a little bit today. His involvement in the Milken Archive goes back about 20 years. We released an album in 2004, I believe, that featured 3 of his compositions. Those were Ladino Songs of Love and Suffering. This is a piece for which Bruce took several traditional Sephardic songs, got rid of all the music and just kept the text and wrote new music to these traditional songs for a very unusual ensemble of guitar, French horn, and voice. We recorded an excerpt from his opera, Michels the Wise. This is an opera about the actor and activist Solomon Michels. He was known in the early 20th century for, he did Shakespeare in Yiddish, and he was also a representative of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in the Soviet Union. And we recorded a piece of his called Out of the Whirlwind, which is a suite of Yiddish songs by victims of the Holocaust that is scored for voice in an extended wind ensemble. Today, we're going to be learning about and listening to a few works, again, on themes of human rights. The first 2 involve the rabbi and activist Joachim Prinz. These make up an album that was just released by the Milken Archive in February. And the third piece is about the Viennese violinist Alma Rosé. So Bruce, I'd like to start by welcoming you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeff.
I thought maybe to get things started off here, you could talk a little bit about who Joachim Prinz is and how you came to learn about him.
Sure. Well, Joachim Prinz was a very outspoken and daring and famous rabbi in Berlin during the Nazi period, who then came to the United States. I mean, he had to come, obviously, he had to get out of Germany, came to the United States, and while he was here, became very involved with the civil rights activities of the 50s and 60s, and became a close friend of Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, if you Google Joachim Prinz, P-R-I-N-Z, you will find many photographs of him with Martin Luther King in all kinds of, not only the March on Washington, oh, there you go. Well, there they are on the left of the screen. That's Joachim Prinz with Martin Luther King Jr. There he is as a rabbi, and there he is with Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, it looks like.
Robert Kennedy, yes.
Yeah. And Prince, I first heard about him because he is a relative of my wife's father, I mean, my wife's side of the family. And through the Henry Stroke, who is my wife's father, I also then met Lucy Prince and Jonathan Prince, the son and daughter, Lucy the daughter, Jonathan the son, and Joachim Prinz. And his outspokenness, and both in the United States and in Germany, carried a very powerful message. He was certainly not the only one to say this, but he said it at the March on Washington right before the I Have a Dream speech, which was that the most tragic and the most shameful, the most urgent and the most disgraceful problem is silence. And he didn't want America to become a nation of onlookers. And I became very involved with thinking about Prince. We can talk about it more later, but it had to do with how I grew up also, that it really resonated with my childhood and my father, my ideas of what Jewish identity means in America. And so I set some of his words to music, and that's the first relationship to Prince. And then that eventually led me to write a concerto, violin concerto, where the violin represented Joachim Prince. And I suppose, I don't want to get ahead of myself, Jeff. Where should we begin then?
I think that's a good, no, I think that's a good stop to, or a good place to pause for a moment here. And I'm glad you brought up the speech that he did give at the March on Washington in 1963. When we think about sort of Jews being very active in the civil rights movement, the first name that I think comes to mind for many people is Abraham Joshua Heschel. So Prince was someone that that I also did not really know about until I came to know him through your music. And fortunately, there are a few recordings of Prince speaking, and that speech he gave at the March on Washington was recorded. I think it was about a 5 or 6 minute speech. So what I've done today is just taken about a minute or so excerpted from that speech. He'll talk first about how the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement is kind of coming from two angles, one from the spirit of Judaism and one from the historic Jewish experience. And then on that note, he talks about some of the things he learned being a rabbi and a leader in the Jewish community while in Berlin under the Hitler regime. So I'm told that this speech comes in just a little bit loud, so you may want to have your finger on the volume button.
I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which makes a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to the great demonstrations in which thousands of us proudly participate a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life, and under those tragic circumstances, is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence.
So that's the end of that speech, of course, is the text that you keyed into. So you learned about Prince, you heard this speech, which must have been one of the highlights of his life, to get to speak to such a large crowd and to be able to speak before someone like Martin Luther King. This eventually led you to compose this cantata, roughly 30-minute cantata, that brought together many different texts. And this is a piece called Reach Out, Raise Hope, Change Society. So maybe you could set us up a little bit for what we're going to hear. We're going to listen to the movement of that cantata that is based on those final words from Joachim Prince's speech at the March on Washington, but you brought in some other texts as well.
Yes, well, the University of Michigan School of Social Work was celebrating its 90th anniversary 10 years ago and commissioned this piece from me, which I think was, I'm actually sure, it was the first time that the School of Social Work had ever gotten involved in the arts directly. And they commissioned this work along with the School of Music and asked me to write it for the chamber choir with some instruments. And the only thing I took as a text from the School of Social Work was their slogan, reach out, raise hope, change society, because I know it's a slogan, but it's also a wonderful, very short, powerful text because of the hope. I mean, reach out and then raise hope. You know, something good is meant by change society. So that I set that to music first. And then the very next thing I did was go to my quote that I wanted to use for something of Joachim Prince. I want to add, though, that one of the people on this Zoom, Carolivia Heron, wrote one of the texts that I also set, which is called We Are Free. That's a much larger movement. And if people want to hear the entire piece, it's easy to do on the Milken Archive site or through Spotify or Apple or Amazon. So the Joachim Prince text about silence is a challenging thing to set. It would be probably even worse to try to set it as a solo voice, to be trying to capture the sound of Joachim Prince as a speaker in singing. It wouldn't work very well. But I found the idea that this is a chorus made the statement more public and in a way more powerful. And then I wrestled with the idea of what do I do with the word silence when they're singing? And I won't say what I did, and it may sometimes the most clear, I won't say the most obvious, but the clearest choice is often the right one. So I tried to do that twice, two different versions of that idea. So this is scored for wind quintet and chorus, and this is from the premiere of the School of Social Works Commission, which they, by the way, for their 100th anniversary this year, they featured the piece again, which was a great honor. We were part of it. Jeff and I were part of that celebration. Shall we hear it, or?
Yes, we will listen to the second movement of Reach Out, Raise Hope, Change Society, which is based on the ending of that speech we just listened to by Joachim Prince. So you keyed us into the way in which you had to deal with this idea of silence, which you dealt with in a couple of ways. I was wondering, aside from the word silence, what was it like to work with this text? Because it strikes me as a very profound statement, but not necessarily one that's maybe particularly amenable to musical treatment.
Well, that's my favorite kind of text, actually.
Oh, really?
One of my favorite. I should say I have various things that I like, but I find it hard to work with a very heavily rhyming, heavy beated text, because that makes you want to do certain things that reins in your imagination. So here is a text that is just an idea. And because it's just an idea, it's possible to imagine it many different ways. And in fact, I worked against the idea of oratory. When he said the most urgent, the most tragic, I didn't want to do that because that works in a public setting and it wouldn't work in a choral setting. So instead, I tried to make it feel very internalized, as if you're obsessed, thinking over and over about the thing that is so tragic and so shameful to yourself. So having a chorus feel internal, I felt was a very special mood, which led me to then just speaking the word silence. Also, I know there are people here who probably realized that was a Jewish mode the entire time, very famous Phrygian mode with a raised third. I don't usually use obvious modes like that in such a way, but I really felt here that I wanted to couch it in a simple kind of almost rabbinical, since he was a rabbi, atmosphere. So I had this swirling, repetitive ostinato. There are only 5 bars of the same mode that keep repeating, and then over it in a kind of heterophonic texture, which means a kind of every voice is ornamenting the same idea, pulling strands of the same thread. That makes it feel very obsessive. And I guess the main thing that I decided to do with that movement was to make it, as I said, internal rather than an external statement, so that it feels personal and kind of urgent. It's a 30-minute work, and that movement is one of the shorter ones. But I felt it was really important to start with Joachim Prince to get me going with that piece.
Mm-hmm. Did you find similar themes in some of the other texts you chose? I know there are a number of themes going on in the different texts.
Yes, well, the cantata has a range of themes, but they all have to do with being an ethical person, of caring about peace, making statements against war, caring about, one of the great lines is to consider love as an imperative need. Also doesn't sound like a song, The words imperative need are kind of hard to set. This is from Dominique de Menil, to consider love as an imperative need. I thought that's an amazing statement. And I felt that I wasn't writing songs here. I'm setting important statements in different ways. And since I had enough time with a 30-minute work, there are many different approaches. And Carolivia Haron's text about freedom, that one has its own incredible energy just soaring forward, and I try to just stay with it. I sort of like jumping on the text and hanging on because it really moves fast. And that one is the longest movement because it's the biggest text, and I saved that for right before the end, where then I return to the statement, reach out, raise hope, change society. So all of the texts are incredibly different in length, whether it's poetry or not, whether something may rhyme or not. I use some proverbs just to give and some of the things, there's something from China. There's an Indian thing, a text. And I try to give the feeling that this is a worldwide statement, knowing that in 30 minutes, then suddenly 30 minutes feels short. You can't really do that. But I did travel the world a little bit with the text and try to give the feeling that we're all in this together. And we need love, we need peace, we need humanity, we need empathy, and we need freedom and justice.
Very well said. So yeah, I told everyone he was really good at
because,
talking about this.
well, when you get to justice, you need to pause for a moment.
Yeah. Well, it gives it a nice, a very universal kind of message that it's not just about this one particular, rabbi's experience during the Hitler era, and surviving that, but that this is about a much more humanistic kind of and universal kind of issue. So this was your first work involving something related to Joachim Prince, but then you were approached by the violinist Sharon Rothman. She wanted you to write a piece for her, which probably most composers wouldn't go, oh yeah, I know the story about this rabbi who lived in Berlin. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the piece came about, how you conceived of doing a violin concerto that somehow would pertain to Joachim Prince.
Well, as I mentioned, I was thinking, what else can I do with the story of Joachim Prince? And I was thinking about writing an opera. I had written already several operas, but it's a huge project, and a libretto is always very complex and often with a subject as profound as that, it could take years and years. And during that time, Sharon Rothman approached me wanting me to write her something for violin and maybe a concerto. And while we were discussing this, it just hit me, this might be the perfect solution, because the violin, historically, it's an instrument that is associated very heavily with Jewish performers and Jewish music. You can make a list, we'd be here all day, of great famous Jewish violinists who Yehudi Menuhin and Yasha Heifetz and Isaac Stern and Itzhak Perlman and Pinchas Zuckerman, and then you can keep going to the younger generation. You can go back to Brahms's friend Joachim, not Joachim Prince, but Joseph Joachim, and so many. You can go sideways to Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, it's just an image that we all think of fiddlers and violinists through klezmer, but also in other ways as part of Jewish life. In fact, Joachim Prince was not interested in klezmer music. So I actually, when I found that out from Lucy Prince in the concerto, I made sure I didn't use any klezmer, which was on my mind. So I decided that the violin could be Joachim Prince, and that his voice could speak through the violin, and the orchestra could be everything else. And in some ways I felt freer than trying to write an opera about a great speaker, a great orator, on such an incredibly difficult subject, with the idea of being in Nazi Germany and America. It's still, it could be possible. Maybe I'll do it someday, but this felt like, because it had no words, that I could go deeply straight into music faster and more personally, and just let my imagination go and not have to deal with the complexities of something that might go on for years. So I divided the piece into two sections. The first movement, Berlin during the Nazi era, and the second movement, America during the Civil Rights Movement. You see there in these pictures, that's Michael Stern, who conducted the premiere of the piece and who happens to be Isaac Stern's son. And that's Sharon Rothman, the violinist. And underneath it is the orchestra that did the premiere, the Iris Orchestra. I found out after I started working on this piece from Sharon that she went home and I guess she told her parents that she was going to premiere a piece about a guy named Joachim Prince. And they said that he married them, that Joachim Prince performed their wedding ceremony because they were from Tenafly, New Jersey. And Joachim Prince, I'm sure many people here know that he was in New Jersey for years as a functioning rabbi. So that was just a strange coincidence. So the first movement, which I think we're going to hear in a moment, the violin speaks in a kind of music that draws on cantorial inflection, cantorial rhythm, but also the rhythm of oratory. the rhythm of impassioned pleading and speaking about the things that matter in the world, which in music, it has more to do with the energy, the dynamics, the phrasing, and the notes are tied in many cases to Jewish cantorial concepts, not strictly. The orchestra is primarily the environment in the first movement of Nazi Germany. And I even used some of the feeling of music of that time, the contemporary classical music of that time, as a reference point to make it feel German and expressionist. But I also let the orchestra occasionally represent Jews fleeing Germany. And you will hear in the orchestra a mix of Jewish inflected music, terrifying militaristic Nazi regime music, and of course the voice of the violinist Prince. And you will hear that the orchestra at the end of the movement basically tries to destroy the voice of Joachim Prince, but fails.
I'm glad you answered the question I was just going to ask you, which was to talk a little bit about how the piece was structured, and you have explained that very well. So we will move into listening to a bit of this concerto. We did not have time to work in a listen to the whole thing. It's about 22 minutes long. So we're going to hear the first movement in its entirety, which is about 9 minutes, and then about the last 2 to 3 minutes of the second movement. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that after it has concluded. Now we'll hear just the last couple of minutes from the second movement. You were mentioning the two different kind of movements there representing two different experiences, Bruce. And I was thinking the kind of musical language you're using to represent the European Jewish experience and then the American sort of civil rights experience are very different musical languages.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it was like to work with those, any difficulties bringing them together. The other thing that strikes me listening to it again is just, it seems like a really difficult piece, both for the violinist and the orchestra.
Well, I'll start with the vocabulary. Jeff, I don't know why if I'm hearing myself talk after I speak, but if anybody technical can play around with that. But anyway.
We're not hearing that.
Okay, good. The vocabulary choice is based on this idea that I have when I write a piece of music that I'm telling a story. And what matters to me most is that the story be clear and that what I'm saying be clear. So the vocabulary that I use in this work is very specific to this piece for me. And I feel like that's true for everything I do. I mean, I'm trying to, whatever my musical personality may be that finds its way into my music is not actually my concern. So my concern is, am I saying what I want to say? And that's why I felt that I needed, in the second movement, to draw upon protest songs, which there was only the hint in that little fragment of We Shall Overcome appears for just a moment. But We Shall Overcome and also Oh Freedom, both of those appear in fragments as part of a texture throughout the piece. Never quoted in full because that I think would have worked against the music. And I took elements of jazz, which of course is actually, I grew up with a lot of jazz and I played jazz piano all my life. So bringing a little bit of that in there is to make it American, some of it to make it African-American. There's references to the whole American way of music making throughout that movement. At the same time as the violin remains essentially a cantorial Jewish voice, but mixed in, as you heard even in that brief moment, mixed into that are some of the elements that make it American, which is exactly what happened to Joachim Prince. I mean, he was a Jewish German rabbi who came to America and became a great American speaker and a civil rights activist. So I felt like the violin could actually kind of do that by keeping the cantorial element and the European nature of the violin writing mixed with some of the American flavor. And I felt like I was trying to, in sound, paint a portrait of Joachim Prince and then support that with the orchestra. It ends with a big question mark, which is always a decision how to end a piece of music. It's possible always to end something with a bang. It's possible to end it by letting something trail away. There's infinite choices, but I felt that it needed to have a climactic but unfinished feeling because it's exactly where it is. And as you know, this week is a perfect example of how we're still following America's very scary, narrow path of trying to find justice for everyone in this country with the trial going on. And so I felt the question mark was the right thing to do. I feel even more so now as time has passed that I'm glad it didn't end triumphantly because it would be a sour note. It'd be wrong. And I'm sad to say that the piece is maybe more relevant than when I was working on it.
Yeah.
Oh, as far
Sounds
as
like you really want.
Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah. As far as the difficulty of the piece goes, it's not as difficult as it sounds. And I say that because that matters to me as a composer. It's possible to write music that is extremely hard to play or very easy to play. What I feel is important is that when a piece sounds difficult, it's because the message is difficult, not because it's hard to play on the instrument, but because you're saying something that has complexity. So the violin writing is challenging, but it's already been played by 6 violinists. And I have not one of them has called me ever to ask a question about the technique or what should they do or say it's hard. So I feel like that it's probably not as difficult as it sounds. And the orchestra, orchestras these days, in every case, they did it on 3 rehearsals. So that's the way it is right now. Orchestras are amazing. And great conductors too.
Yeah, that is. And it sounds like you wanted to leave the audience with a little bit of a sense of that urgency that Prince was right. reflecting in his March on Washington speech. Since you work, we're going to listen to another piece of yours in a minute, but since we're talking, we can talk for a couple more minutes. Since you work in so many different aspects of music, writing music that has some sort of Jewish inflection has been a not insignificant part of your work. So maybe you could talk a little about how you approach this as a composer, does it require a different kind of approach or a different thought process?
Well, going back to what I said earlier, I really do feel like I'm telling a story in every piece. And that doesn't mean that it's a story that can be told in words. This one can. Sometimes it seems very difficult, but it's the narrative arc in the sense of communicating something specific to me. And whether or not that is clear by a title or a story that is spelled out varies. I also write a lot of music for kids, which has given me a great deal of experience in telling stories, because that's the way I always do that. I mean, not to get far away from the Jewish question, but I also wrote a piece about dinosaurs for kids, which is my most played piece. And I think from what I can tell that dinosaurs were around way before the Jews. If anybody disagrees with me on that, just tell Jeff about it later. But anyway, so I know there are theme parks in America that have Jesus riding a dinosaur. That's what we're dealing with. So education is difficult. Yeah. I'm not kidding about that, by the way. It's completely true. So the Jewish pieces for me are like every piece. I focus on what am I saying? Why am I writing this piece? What am I trying to get across? And the vocabulary and the imagery, the structure, all of it is about that idea, rather than thinking just purely abstractly. I mean, music is abstract, although there are arguments about this, but it is a language, and it does have a sense of grammar and syntax, and the more one composes, or I should say the more I compose, to be safer, the more I compose, the more I feel like I know how to say what I need to say. And whether it's a Jewish-focused piece or not will determine some aspects of the sound, but it doesn't change the process for me.
Mm-hmm. So one of the final pieces we'll listen to today is it's another Jewish violin concerto. This one has
not exactly a violin.
So this one has a very evocative title, I Too Bleed and Hope for Beauty. And this is about a woman named Alma Rosé. Could you talk a little bit about who she was and how this piece came to be?
Well, Alma Rosé, she's quite a well-known name. If people's memories might be jogged, there's a movie about her, which is actually not very good, it turns out, historically. But she was the leader when she was in Auschwitz. I'm skipping ahead, but that's what the story's about. She was in Auschwitz and was the leader of the women's orchestra, which was only actually a very small group. Now, what you're seeing here has nothing to do with Auschwitz there. She was a very popular violinist with her group of the Vienna Waltzing Maidens. They were all violinists, and they played popular music of the time, and they played all over Europe. She was quite famous. Her father was Arnold Rosé, who was the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic and also the opera, and was also in the Rosé Quartet, and her uncle was Gustav Mahler. So Alma Rosé was kind of the royalty of musical life in Europe. And yes, that royal group was in a way mostly Jewish because of Mahler and the Rosé Quartet and Arnold Schoenberg. they were all connected. And yet, of course, as we know, that didn't have anything to do with saving her life. Being Jewish, that's all that mattered to Nazis, and she was eventually, after many escapes, was captured and brought to Auschwitz. At Auschwitz, she managed to have her violin and played, and one of the great paradoxes and phenomena of human beings is that there were these guards who were able to inflict torture, misery, and death on people, but also wanted to hear her play. And they wanted to hear classical music and urged her to put together an ensemble so they could have some live music entertainment. She managed to save the lives of, I think it's 24 women who played in this group. She herself died of botulism in the camp, what may have been an accidental poisoning, we'll never really know, but she was not gassed. Now, the title, I Too Bleed and Hope for Beauty, comes from the fact that there was a nurse working at Auschwitz who became her friend, Alma Rosé's friend. And when she heard Alma play the violin, she said, "Your violin is saying, I too bleed and hope for beauty." And that really struck me, not only because it's powerful, but to me, I think of music that way, as you can tell, that the violin is saying something. And she actually gave it the perfect words, "I too bleed and hope for beauty." And I couldn't think of anything better to call this piece. Now, this is not actually a violin concerto. It does feature the concertmaster in about 3 or 4 solos throughout the piece. At the end, we do hear the violinist, so it seems like another violin concerto. But actually, the orchestra has many soloists in it, with the concertmaster leading the way because she was a violinist. So that does make sense. We're going to hear the end of this piece, and I think it's important to compare it to what we just heard, at least for me, because what we just heard ended with this question mark. As I said, it has a kind of feeling of maybe hope, but it certainly is not a definite ending. This one has 2 overlapping endings. It almost has 3. It comes to a cadence, and then you hear a final chord with the violin solo very high and the strings playing a harmony underneath it. And that sounds a little bit like the ending of this other piece, but then another chord comes in that changes the mood drastically, because I really was wrestling with the idea of what is the mood of the end. She died. It's about Auschwitz, but she also was a figure of great importance and hope. And the word hope is in the title, Hope for Beauty. So I wanted to capture both the sense of hope and the tragedy. And so I layered 2 different endings on top of each other. And we're going to hear that.
Great, let's take a listen now. We'll say it has the feeling you think it's going to end a few times before
Yes,
it actually does. Yeah.
you do, although it's kind of hard to tell on a recording. In the concert hall, that sound, there was never actual silence. It's a little bit hard to tell on this recording because this was not a commercial released recording. This is just from the concert. So it does sound, a few times it sounds more like it stops than it did in the hall where you could still hear the resonance. And I think if we were recording that piece for a release, there'd be a definite effort to make sure there was no actual silence between any of those moments.
I see.
But the last chord, and you hear the violin, I don't know if this is going to sound like anything, but you have this chord. And while that rings, as it's fading, you hear this. And so, I mean, I can't say it better than the music does, but it was a decision to take, this, for those who are musicians, this is an F minor chord with the violin playing a very high ninth. And this is an F sharp minor chord. So they're very important is not just the fact that they're ending in two different keys, but that they're very spatially far away, extremely high and extremely low. And there's nothing in the middle. So there's an actual emptiness. Because I felt one of the ways to create the feeling of emptiness is to make an empty spot. So I like doing that with music. I like to think about how to create a very specific sonic image. And it's always a challenge. I have to say, when I decided to do that at the ending and have this empty middle and these two extremes, if you are a creative person, you understand. I was elated. I was just so happy to have discovered how to make that tragic feeling happen. It's a weird feeling to be so happy about that, and then you calm down and remember what you're doing.
It's surprising too, because you would think an F minor chord with an F sharp chord combined would sound just incredibly dissonant, but when they're spaced so far apart, the dissonance is sort of there, but it's not jarring.
Well, what you're able to do is hear it as two completely separate things with that empty space. So you're not hearing them as, I mean, if I played them on top of each other, it would be that. You're not hearing it. They're spaced so far apart that they have completely different life. And they are saying different things.
Yeah. It just reminds me of, sometimes people describe composing in very non-creative terms, that a composer is someone who works with tools. And this is a great example of that, of working with the tool of dissonance, but in a very specific way. Since we touched on this, I mean, through both of or I guess all three of the pieces we have listened to today, touch in some way on the kind of Holocaust experience, or at least European anti-Semitism. And I know this does not, you write about lots of other Jewish topics when it comes to music, but this is one that comes back to you somewhat frequently. Is there any sort of ethical dilemma that comes up for you here? Or, I mean, it's one thing to write Jewish music, it's another thing to write something about this very specific catastrophe.
I understand the question. It comes up frequently. I would say the question underneath it is the possibility of exploiting this subject musically, which would be horrible, would be a terrible thing. I think of it, writing a piece of music about this, no differently than writing an essay about it. I mean, or writing memoirs. I mean, I was obviously not there, but I certainly know people who were, and we all do. And for me, I'm not making a movie, which also can be a great thing, but it's scary. We're turning it into fiction. I think of composing exactly as I would if I were being asked to reflect on my feelings about Joachim Prince or about the Holocaust or something. It's just that the language is music. And I feel like I take it very seriously, and I don't intend to either, and I don't think I do, either manipulate people's feelings or try to make points for a particular point of view. I'm just writing this, as I say, directly from the heart and from my information, trying to, that's one of the reasons I feel it's important to try to very specifically ask myself in every phrase, what is this saying? And how does the music say that? So it's not like a generalized concept, which then I emote and just write emotional music. That I would find perhaps, if it's not well done, could be offensive on a subject like this. But
Sure.
I also think it's very important that the subject be discussed, be talked. I mean, I don't have to convince you, but that the subject be out there and discussed and never forgotten. Jeff, if you want to know more about this, the Milken Archive of Jewish Music is a really good place for you to take a look at the repertoire. Oh, I'm sorry, you're the director.
Oh, I haven't heard of that. I'll have to check that out. Yeah.
Right. But I'm glad you asked that. It does come up frequently. And one of the most moving times that happened, Isabel, you were actually there when this happened. I was in Houston, at the Holocaust Museum in Houston, and presented several pieces, two of mine, one of Isabel's, about Holocaust-related material. Mm-hmm. And someone stood up and asked exactly that question. But much more directly, do you feel that you might be manipulating or exploiting the Holocaust? And I answered very thoroughly how I felt that that was not the case. And then the guy applauded and said, I don't think you are either. It was just, he had to bring that out.
Yeah.
So it was a strange moment. Do you remember that, Isabel? That was a strange moment.
Yeah, and I certainly didn't mean that, the question in a confrontational way. It is just something that comes up so often,
Exactly. Yeah. No, of course.
In this field. So, well, thank you so much for sharing these wonderful pieces with us today. And as they say, and now for something completely different, we are going to wrap our session up today with a little piano puzzler. So for those of you who may not know how this works, Bruce is not only a great composer, as we have learned today, but he's also really great at imitating other composers and doing all sorts of kind of sneaky creative things with music. Piano Puzzlers is a weekly radio show and podcast. And each week, Bruce takes a popular tune or a folk song and recomposes it or rearranges it in the style of a particular composer from the Western classical tradition. And then listeners call into the show and try to guess both the name of the tune that he's working with and also the name of the composer whose style is being emulated. So Bruce is going to play one of these puzzlers for us, and you will all have the opportunity to guess. So he will, usually the way this works is he plays the tune all the way through, and we will all simply listen to it. And then once he's done, if you want to make a guess, you can just use the raise your hand function.
Or they can go like that.
That works directly in Zoom. What was that?
I think they could also actually raise their hands, probably.
As long as we can see everybody, that also works.
Also, Jeff, I'm wondering, after the puzzler, do we have a little time for questions about other things?
We will have plenty of time for questions and answers after this.
Very, very good. Good. All right. Now, I want to tell everyone that this puzzler, I'm playing on my digital electric piano because that's my setup here. So I'm not playing on a real piano. There's one in the next room, but and I don't know how it sounds over Zoom. So let's just imagine that it's a Steinway in a concert hall and hope it works out okay.
Very, very nice. So I think Isabel might be the. Sounds like almost everybody got the tune, and there are a few guesses. I'm looking at the chat now. A few guesses as to the composer. So why don't we let Isabel Gans go first?
I think it's the style of Debussy.
Well, you're as close as you can be without being exactly right.
Ravel?
Yes. Right, it's Ravel, and it's actually using. Does anyone know the piece of Ravel that it's based on? Maybe you should, if you do, just say so.
Gaspar?
Yes. Yes, a composer, of course. Yes. It's Gaspard de la Nuit, the first movement. Is this coming across distorted, or can you actually hear this?
It's a little distorted bit.
Distorted, yeah. Anyway, it uses the configuration of Gaspard de la Nuit, the first movement, Ondine, and some of the, obviously the harmonies, and then it's, everyone knows the tune, right?
I must say the tune, because I've heard this particular puzzler before. Right. And the first time I heard it, the tune was not as apparent. However you played it just now, it was very clear.
Right. Also, this is,
so.
Yes, this is a Jewish conference, so I thought I better use a piano puzzler. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's what those are like, you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that sure. with us. I think that's if you don't listen to those on the regular, you can get kind of addicted and just, you know, tune into the podcast and start burning through a bunch of them. They're super fun to do.
Yeah, they've been on the radio now for this is coming up the 19th season.
19, wow.
19 years, yeah. Coming up to it.
Yeah, and I guess, well, maybe I'll take the initiative to ask the first question then, and just ask you to explain to everyone how the piano puzzlers came to be a thing. And then we'll open it up to the group to ask other questions.
Well, the piano puzzlers, it actually started when I was teaching theory at Juilliard pre-college a very long time ago. I started teaching there myself when I was quite young. And I wanted the kids in my theory class to like theory. And, you know, musicians, it's typical, especially when they're teenagers, they want to play an orchestra, chamber music, and sing and everything, but they don't want to go to classrooms because it makes music into an academic subject. So they're always a little restless. Then they get older and they like it more. And then eventually, when they're really ready to study music theory and history, it's because they've already graduated. You know, looking back thinking, oh, why didn't I pay attention? So basically, I tried to make it fun by taking a piece that we were working on. Let's say we were studying a piece by Brahms, and inserting a popular tune that the kids might know, although they were mostly classical musicians, or all classical musicians, a popular, like a Beatles tune, and inserting it into the Brahms. And then I would give them a homework assignment and say, can you take this melody, whatever it might be, and let's see if you can make it sound like the piece we're listening to by Brahms. And I always did the homework myself. I never gave an assignment and didn't do it because I thought that's unfair. So whatever I'd asked them to do, I would do it. And then I started to collect a few of these. And then skip forward in time when I got the job in 1992 to give lectures for the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, where I still am. I occasionally would throw in a piano puzzler as a way of entertaining the pre-concert orchestra audience. So for example, I would say, on the program tonight, there's this particular piece by Mozart and it ends with Stravinsky. What if they wrote a piece together? And I would play a mix-up of the Stravinsky and the Mozart. And those became expected. People asked for them. And then somebody from National Public Radio was in the audience once, Anya Grunman, and she invited me to do one on the radio. And that turned into a program with Fred Child. And then it's moved to American Public Media after 9/11, actually. And it's now been, as I say, almost 19 years.
Wow. Okay, I'm sure we have questions out there.
Yeah, we can get back to the non-puzzler questions.
Yes, looks like Rachel has a question.
Hi there.
Hello.
First of all, I really love the idea of the piano puzzlers because my dad brought me up listening to Tom Lehrer, and I was thinking of his Clementine, and you know, and just what a wonderful what a wonderful teaching tool that is. I was kind of interested in, while you were talking, I was looking through your website a little bit, and I saw a lot of the descriptions of pieces you'd written that were sort of commentary on historical events, on the civil rights movement, on the Holocaust. You had one about Marian Anderson. And I was kind of wondering, I mean, clearly you write these so that because you have something to say about all of these topics, and one generally doesn't come up with something to say without having learned a little bit. So I was wondering sort of how you approach history, or how you get into historical events that you ultimately want to write a piece of music about, and how you approach reading about history with the eye to, or the ear, I guess, to having something to say in sound.
It's a great question. I want to say that it's not always my idea. For example, the Marian Anderson opera, again, that happens to, we have the librettist, Carolivia Heron is here. There she is, waving her hands. She had already had that project going, and I was eventually hooked up with her to write this through the Washington National Opera and the Washington something Society.
Performing Arts Society, Washington Performing Arts Society.
Right, the Washington Performing Arts Society and the Washington National Opera. They put us together, but she had already been working on it as the librettist without a composer. But generally, I think one of the reasons I was asked to do that was that some of the people involved knew that I had also been writing other human rights oriented pieces. But I mean, I feel like music needs to be relevant. One of the big challenges to the classical world of music, and by that I just mean not popular music, non-commercial music, you know. One of the challenges has been to be relevant to the society at large rather than something that's just marginal or expensive or you need education for. And I've always felt that to address specifically the things that are most important in the world, this should be a part of what we do in the arts. Seems obvious, but maybe it is. But for me, I study something as if I'm going to write about it in words. And sometimes I do a little bit to myself. I mean, when I write program notes about something, frequently, I start those program notes before I write any music, and I finish them afterwards. And I don't think of them as program notes. I'm taking notes for myself, and eventually that becomes part of a liner note. But in the case of all of these pieces, like Alma Rosé is a very good example. The River Oaks Chamber Orchestra wanted to commission something from me. And the reason they wanted a piece was they had performed the Joachim Prince concerto, I Will Not Remain Silent. And they decided they wanted another piece. And actually they got 3 pieces. And Alicia Lawyer, who runs that organization, because the only thing of mine she had heard live was the piece that they presented, which was the violin concerto. She said, do you want to do more pieces on Jewish subjects or on the Holocaust, etc.? And I said, maybe. Let me think about it, because it's always a very big emotional drain to start down that path. So the first idea I had was about the night of actually when a group of doctors were murdered in Russia. And
that's Stalin's purge of the doctors?
Yes, Stalin.
Okay.
That was the first suggestion I made to Alicia. And she came back a few days later and said, it's too upsetting for her to even think about doing a piece of music on that. So she said, can there be hope in it? There was no hope in that story. So it was an interesting challenge, but I just started reading things. And of course, I had heard of Alma Rosé and the Auschwitz Orchestra, but I knew very little about it. And I knew she was Mahler's niece. And the Rosé Quartet had premiered not only works of Schoenberg, but works of Brahms. It was an interesting group because, Brahms died in 1897 and he was only in his 60s. And there's an overlap into the 20th century that's kind of amazing with these musicians. Yeah. So knowing just that sort of thing, I started to read, there's one great book on Alma Rosé. I read that book and I became obsessed with doing something about her. And it made sense because she played the violin. She was related to this musical royalty. The question of hope, when I found that quote, "I too bleed and hope for beauty," that sort of answered that. But I don't know. I mean, hope is part of the human condition for people who are alive. I would imagine. If you're alive, you've got to figure out a way to have hope. I guess it's true that if you tell a story where a lot of people are suddenly murdered, it's probably not as good a story for this purpose as a woman who saved the lives of 24 people through music, and also for a while saved herself through music. So it also says something about music. Mm-hmm. And so that's what that was. I read the book and I took notes as if I was going to write a thesis on her, mm-hmm. and then pared it down to what could possibly be said in music as far as I was concerned, and then wrote the piece. But that's basically the process. And I learned a lot doing it. I learned a lot about her. I learned a lot about, I thought I knew plenty about the Holocaust, but there's always a lot to learn, and it's devastating and upsetting. This book about Alma Rosé has more statistics in it than any book I'd ever seen on the subject. Pages and pages of detailed statistics about people coming and going in Auschwitz. So it was really incredible. So I learned a lot there, and then you always learn a lot trying to, once you digest something, to give it out in some form. Mm-hmm. And the learning, I feel like I always want to learn something when I do any project. Like if I'm giving a lecture on a piece of music, even if I've known it for years, I try to find something in it that I didn't think about before as a way of talking about it, because I feel like that makes it more interesting for me, which makes it more interesting to listen to. So I prepare, but I never have notes for a talk more than just a few reminders. And I feel like it's important when writing also to steep yourself in something you can't not think about it when you're working, and you don't have to keep checking what am I writing about, but you're immersed in it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's been a virtual hand up for a while now. I want to just make sure and see if Karen Baird, do you have a question for Bruce Adolphe? I think it may have been raised.
Well, there's also a lot of things in their chat there.
Since she entered the room, the most recent question I've picked up in the chat is if that book by Alma Rosé is, or about Alma Rosé is by Richard Newman.
Yes, it's the only one. Yes.
That is the book you're referring to.
That is the only book on her, as far as I know.
Yeah. Most of the other questions in the chat had to do with the piano puzzler we were doing. So
okay.
Anybody else have questions for Bruce?
Larry.
Yeah, Larry, go ahead. And then Agnes Corey will be next.
Just a quick question. It's still rattling around in my head that you said that the orchestra had 3 rehearsals. And I'm wondering what it's like from your end, considering that I don't know how you work and whether you're mocking things up or how you hold this in your head as to what it should sound like. And then you have 3 rehearsals to a performance. And what is it like when you hear it the first time? And do they get it right? And do you work with them? And how hard? It kind of boggles my mind to think of how, if there's a learning curve, what that's like, and what that's like for you as well, having it come to life that way.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of questions in there. First of all, I want to distinguish between orchestra and everything else. Orchestras are very expensive and there are a lot of people, and they do have to move quickly in terms of time, and I'll get right back to that. But if I write a string quartet, they might have 35 rehearsals because they are like a family. And they work and work and work and rehearse. They can rehearse all they want, and as much as they want, and they never stop. But also, for me, I don't get surprised by hearing my music in terms of I didn't expect that to sound like that. I know what it's going to sound like. Different players bring different things to it. And so there's always an interpretive aspect that's fascinating. But in terms of right notes or rhythms, or none of that is a surprise. And also, that was true for me before the technology. But now, your computer can play the music for you. If you want to check something, you can have a fairly decent, if mechanical, unnuanced, inhuman reading. That's possible. Now, with an orchestra, the learning curve of a professional level orchestra around the world is they sight read something, but they've already practiced their parts, because otherwise they're not going to get into that orchestra. If they come unprepared, that's not possible. They're all ready. They read through the piece, and it's usually 90% correct and without much difficulty, no matter how hard it is. Then the conductor, especially with a really good conductor, gives them a lot of things to improve immediately. And they improve it, they work in little sections. And they fix this, they fix that, they fix this, everything gets fixed. Then they play through that again. And with a great conductor, the efficiency of rehearsing is mind-boggling. And the orchestra, they don't make mistakes twice usually. And even if something was really messy, the conductor will ask them, let's play this 3 times. And by the 3rd time, as they say with professional musicians, you don't play it till you get it right. You play it till you can't get it wrong. And they lock in. I've had this experience many times. It's not unusual. It is amazing. It's totally amazing. I just heard a rehearsal with the Dallas Symphony. They're playing a piece of mine this summer. They sent me there was only 1 rehearsal before the summer, and then they have 2 rehearsals in the summer. At this 1 rehearsal, they read through the piece, and some things were sloppy, but nothing was wrong. And the conductor is Fabio Luisi, amazing conductor, pinpointed every little thing, rehearsed everything just until it was correct, and said, basically the message is that, okay, that was what I want. That's going to stay that way. Then they played through most of it again, and it was fantastic. And it's quite a difficult work. So I think it would be amazing for non-musicians to see an orchestra start a piece that they don't know and watch what happens. It's amazing. So when they ask for a lot of money, I think they usually deserve it. And they're not easily replaced like some board members may think.
Thanks for that question, Larry, and the answer, Bruce. Agnes, would you like to ask Bruce a question?
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Oh, thank you. For me, the text by Robert Prince and the story of Robert Prince, as well as Alma Rosé, it is of great interest and importance, but that's not the same for all concert audiences. So I'm just wondering, are you happy for audiences to listen to the music, to this music in particular, just on its own term, just the music? Or do you want them to be familiar with the story? I don't know how to ask this, but I can see that you understand what I'm driving at.
I understand it, and it is a fantastic question. And I do think about that. And the answer is, I would like them to, I actually have a very complicated answer because we did an experiment on this, but I would like them to hear the music on its own terms, but I often, in the cases of the music we're talking about, these stories are there to be told as well. So I would like to communicate the story of Joachim Prince and the story of Alma Rosé just the same as a novelist would. And you might say, well, you're reading a novel about Alma Rosé. What makes it a good novel? The story of Alma Rosé? No. That's the story. That already happened. That's real. That's not fiction. What makes the fiction good is the writer and the writing. And oddly enough, I'm sure we all know that you can have tremendous pleasure in reading about something terrible and upsetting, because the pleasure of the text is not the same as the emotion of the story. A well-told story and the story may not, they may have a kind of cognitive dissonance in terms of the enjoyment of fine writing and the despair over the story it's telling. So that's a complexity that I'm happy to live with. I write a lot of music that is not about things like this. And so I have plenty of pieces of music that do not tell a dramatic story or are not about a Jewish subject or don't deal with something tragic, etc., including lots of fun pieces and humorous pieces. So I feel like each thing has its own life. The reason I mentioned an experiment, I wrote a string quartet in 1992 that was about the death of a relative by cancer. And it was a very powerful story in which, like these pieces you've heard, the movements said specific things. And there were even instruments in certain places. One represented the disease, and another represented the person, and another represented time. These things were very clear. But with a string quartet teacher in Germany, who was an American, we did an experiment with about 4 student string quartets. These were college and graduate age string quartet students in Germany, playing them this piece without telling them anything about it at all. And then they were told that the piece does have a narrative. What do you think it is? And they all wrote down what they thought. And what was amazing is that all of them were right in a way, even if they didn't mention disease. Like, instead of disease, some had war, some had divorce. But they all knew which instruments were which. They all knew there was time. They all knew that one was, instead of a disease, one was a threat. They knew that the one that was suffering was a human being suffering, and they didn't know of what. So they all actually told the story without the scenario. They told the emotional arc of the story. They found the relationship between the instruments and the narrative correctly. So it was a very profound experience for me because they listened to it on its own terms, were affected by it, and brought their own stories to it. I mean, one of them was hearing a very violent divorce because that's what her parents had gone through. And when she said, "Oh, I guess I'm wrong about the story," I said, no, you're not wrong. It's the same story, you know? So that's an important thing, that music, that's one of the reasons I mentioned that I love to write music, instrumental music about things, because it naturally, by this, what music is, takes on a resonance beyond what you are writing about, because people bring their own understanding to it.
It reminds me, Bruce and I were talking just last week in preparation for the session today, and we were talking about this very thing. And I said, when I was studying piano as an undergraduate, I had a teacher once who would make us improvise, like in a group setting. And one of the things she would often do is say, think of an animal and then improvise that animal. And almost every time, the majority of the people in the room could guess exactly what animal you were improvising. It was a really kind of an eye-opening experience about that musical communication, that there was no pretext other than animal, you know?
Right. And of course, not to get into that too much, but you can't improvise a noun, but you can, like a dog, but you can improvise the energy, like if you can play the speed of a small dog or the large floppy qualities of a large dog. You know, you're immediately going into verbs and adjectives and capturing energy in a way that is easy to communicate. And the more difficult the subject, the more complex that is. But I just want to mention, since you said that, I used to teach a workshop at Lincoln Center using improvisation, where we took words and people had words that they were told secretly, and they were to improvise them and people would guess. And Wynton Marsalis was at the time around the corner sharing the office. Lincoln Center's been restructured at the moment since then. But Wynton came in with his trumpet to participate in my class. Everyone else were high school kids, you know, so he came in for fun. And he got the word jealousy. Nobody knew that. That was the word he was supposed to do. That is a very, very, very hard word to improvise. So he looked at me. I knew what the word was because I had handed out some of the words. And he looked at me like, what am I supposed to do? But then he did something amazing. he played the role of two trumpet players playing the same thing. One played great and one didn't play so well and was getting more and more frustrated. And somebody said, that one's jealous of that one, right? So he did it.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Bruce, for joining us today. You've for sharing your music, and you have so much to say about your own music, about music more generally, and about all of the things that you write about. So thanks again for spending your time with us today. Thanks to the audience for joining us as well. And Geraldine, if you would like to wrap up the session and tell us about what's to come. We can't hear you though.
I would love to do that, and to say how privileged we've been to be taken into the background of the music and the stories, and to hear the music of Bruce, and to hear your words, and to have you with us has been a real privilege and pleasure. And Jeff, you've done a wonderful job to bring it all out for us with Jeff. So with Bruce. So thank you so much, both of you. It's been really a pleasure to have you on Conversations on Zoom. Please join us again for our next conversations. Next week, we'll be talking to Edwin Cerruti and Courtney Blue. Edwin said he's doing his session with Courtney Love, but I think that he actually got that a bit mixed up. She says her surname is Courtney Blue, but she's equally delightful. And they're talking about new approaches to Ladino music. And then as a contrast to that, on the 20th of April, Jeremiah Lockwood is bringing along Mayor Baruch Kohn, one of the foremost liturgical experts in the Brooklyn Satmar Hasidic community, and his son Yoel Kohn. So that should be interesting. And then Abigail Wood and Andrea Schmidtges on the 27th are talking about the Caravan Orchestra project, a collaboration between Yiddish Summer Weimar, the Liszt Academy, and the University of Haifa. So we have a lot to look forward to, and hope that everybody will join us. And if you go to Humanities Commons and look for the Jewish Music Group, if you join up, then that's the way you can keep in touch with what's going on, and you can hear about everything that's happening on COZ, which is a program of what we call the International Forum for Jewish Music Studies. And that is a platform that can host a number of different programs. So if you have a particular interest group that you'd like to set up on this platform, please do so. There are, any number of interest groups. And one of our things is Composers in Focus. So we've been absolutely delighted to have you, Bruce, in focus for us today. And I'm sure that we're going to go on to look for a lot of your music, and I hope we can find your piano puzzler somewhere on the internet as well.
That is very easy to do. But first, thank you for all those thank yous, and Jeff, thank you. The piano puzzlers can be found on American Public Media.
Okay. And we'll allow you, if you will, to play us out with another piano puzzler. If you can do one quickly, we'll be very happy to be played out with a piano puzzler from Bruce.
All right, this is another Jewish one, so it'll be kind of obvious.
you.
Rite of spring. The rite
Sounds
of
like
spring.
Stravinsky is about to have a wonderful Hanukkah.
Yeah, exactly. You got it.
Oy Hanukkah.
Wonderful.
Or he's going to have a very bad Hanukkah.
Yes.
Good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.